everybody. Thank you for coming here tonight. My name is Nick Mercado. I am a faculty member in the Department of Health Humanities and Bioethics at the University of Rochester, as well as a member of the Board of Trustees at the Rochester Academy of Medicine. So a little bit about the Academy. Since the 1900s, the Rochester Academy of Medicine has provided educational programs for physicians. Medicine has changed, and so has the Academy. Many healthcare providers in different fields care for patients and families, and in 2021, we became an academy for healthcare professionals from all fields and all organizations and all institutions in Rochester to provide educational programming for both the healthcare community and the Rochester community. Our mission is to advance learning, encourage service, and support collaborations with the communities that we serve. About this specific program, the Ask the Experts program, this program was launched in 2023. The program is a patient and family education series for all communities in and around Rochester. Medical information sources are abundant on the internet and on social media sites. Many contain misinformation, biased information, and information that is not based on scientific evidence, but also true information, and sometimes it is hard to discern what is what. Our panelists address questions, myths, basic physiology, treatment, current healthcare topics for all general audiences, and our experts offer reliable and practical information that will be used for our program. Now about our panelists. We are privileged to have these three esteemed speakers for this evening. Dr. Laura Whitebell is an associate professor in the Writing, Speaking, and Argument program at the University of Rochester. Her background in English and history is central to her focus on writing studies and rhetoric, particularly in her interest in how people use writing and reading to make sense of the world. Currently, her research centers on conspiracy theories and misinformation, with a particular focus on the rhetorical strategies and narrative structures that give these phenomena cultural power and persistence. She is especially interested in how language and discourse can shape concepts like belief, credibility, and authority. Dr. Scott Hartman uses he, him pronouns, and he is current president of the Monroe County Medical Society. He is a professor of family medicine and pediatrics at the University of Rochester Medical Center. He has served in numerous leadership roles in public health, including current board member for the New York State Academy of Family Physicians, has previously chaired of the National American Academy of Family Physicians and chair of health for the public and the science, and I hope I did not butcher that too much. And then our last panelist, Dr. Dan Taramasco, did I pronounce that right? Okay, is an academic hospitalist in the Department of Medicine at Rochester General Hospital, internal medicine residency program. He is an assistant clinical professor, the Rochester Institute of Technology's physician assistant program, and like me is also on the board of trustees at the Rochester Academy of Medicine. So now I'm going to turn this microphone over to Dr. Whitebell to kick off our conversation tonight. Laura?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? If you start being able to hear me, give me some kind of signal and I'll adjust. Thank you, Nick, for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It's blustery, it's windy, it's rainy. I really appreciate you all being here tonight. I was really excited to be invited to be a part of this series. Oh, hang on one second. There we go. So I was really excited to be invited to be a part of this series because we don't get a lot of chances to come together as a community and think carefully about a topic that lots of us are increasingly concerned about. I'm especially glad to be here with my medical colleagues because misinformation and healthcare are topics that are too often discussed together. Misinformation profoundly affects our ability to make informed choices, and healthcare is one of the most important areas in which we need to do that. So over the next little while I'm talking, I'm going to give you a wide overview of misinformation. I'm going to start with some context and some background. We're going to move on to some definitions, and then I'll finish with some ideas about what we can do in response to false or misleading information. I hope this sets the stage for a productive discussion, and then we can all go home feeling like some of our questions have been answered. I think that when we take time to genuinely talk with one another, to make space for trust, for different viewpoints, and for genuine community thinking to happen. And I think that this evening is a chance to try and understand misinformation, not just as an abstract concept, but as something that affects how we live, how we communicate, and how we make decisions together. So as we get started, I want you all just to take one moment to think of an example of misinformation that you've come across recently. I'm not going to call on anyone, but just think of something that you've come across recently. Something maybe on social media, something that somebody told you, something you heard about in the news. Just think of something that you came across. Okay, has everyone got something? So now you're thinking of it. Think about how it made you feel. Think about if it made you feel disturbed or concerned. Did you feel angry? Did you feel fearful? Did you not really care and just move on with your day? Think about how you felt when you encountered that piece of information. And now keep that in your mind. So as I'm talking and as we have our conversation, I want you to keep these ideas, these feelings in your mind, because what I really want to do is to think tonight about how misinformation can affect you, affect your friends, affect your neighbors, and affect your community. So it's very tempting to think that misinformation is a modern problem that was invented alongside the internet, but this is not true. As long as people have been talking to one another, they've been sharing false information, sometimes on purpose and sometimes by mistake. Historians tell us that the Romans used rumors and forged documents to manipulate public opinion. So if you look on the bottom right there, you'll see a picture of Mark Antony, painting of Mark Antony at Julius Caesar's funeral. Mark Antony was a remarkably skilled politician and self-promoter who frequently used propaganda and misinformation to strengthen his position throughout his career, discrediting his rivals and promoting himself as a loyal Roman. Just above that painting, we have Delacroix's famous painting of the French Revolution, a time when propaganda and misinformation were powerful tools used by both revolutionaries and their opponents to shake public opinion. Revolutionary leaders spread pamphlets, newspapers, and posters portraying the monarchy and aristocracy as corrupt enemies of the people, while royalists circulated their own misinformation to depict the revolutionaries as violent radicals, fueling fear and resistance to the new regime. As much as in real life, misinformation appears in works of art, from Shakespeare to Jane Austen, from Marvin Gaye to Fleetwood Mac and Adele. As a narrative device, misinformation is a great way to create drama in a story. So think about your favorite romantic comedy, the one that you secretly watch on Sunday afternoons. Part of the way through the movie, I'm sure that the couple usually breaks up over some silly misunderstanding, but we keep watching just to see the truth come out so they can finally get back together. Similarly, in pop music, artists use rumor or gossip to tell stories about love and heartbreak and the pain of confusing truth and a lie. In I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Marvin Gaye says, "Believe half of what you see and none of what you hear," which sounds like something I want to write on a post-it and stick to my phone the next time I'm scrolling through social media. Great advice, great song. So all of this is to say that misinformation and disinformation have a history as long as that of communication itself. It's tempting to think of rumors and gossip as kind of mild forms of misinformation, different from what we experience today, so they're not really that important. It's also tempting to think of some classic conspiracy theories around topics like the 1969 moon landings as kind of fun and entertaining. However, just because they don't seem urgent to us right now, that doesn't mean they didn't seem urgent to a different person in a different context. In any case, all of these different examples of false information show how we've always lived with knowledge of truths, untruths, and half-truths, and we found ways of negotiating them for better or for worse. Misinformation has become such a bogeyman for us in recent years. I think that when we take a minute to remember that it's always been with us, we can deal with false information that we encounter with a greater sense of perspective. But while misinformation isn't new, I do think that our relationship to it has changed. This is due to two reasons, and number one is the internet. I just want to say at this point that I don't think the internet is neither good nor inherently bad. It's just a tool. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just a thing, and we can use it how we want to. But thanks to digital media, information can spread, accurate or not, with astonishing speed and reach. Social media has amplified this further by transforming us from passive consumers into active participants. We don't just receive information, we don't just open up a web page on the internet, read it, and then close it and move on. We have these handy shortcuts. We all have these little buttons that we can use to share information, to comment on it, to pass it on to those in our networks, and amplify it with our own views. We can, even if we're so inclined, start a blog, write a newsletter, create a YouTube channel, or make our private social media profiles public and reach an even larger audience. This means that we have access to more information than ever, which is overwhelming, and it limits our ability to make decisions. Since users can publish on virtually any topic, regardless of their qualifications or the accuracy of their information, it's hard to work out what we should listen to and which pieces we should or not remember. What's more, social media in particular carefully curates the content that it delivers to our devices, which means that you end up seeing very specific kinds of information. To take a simple example, if you watch a video about a cat, you'll get loads more videos about cats, but you won't get any videos about dogs or giraffes. You'll just get videos about cats. When we're watching videos about medical or healthcare information, we can end up in a similar kind of echo chamber, an endless loop of the same kinds of information where we never get to hear any other points of view. The second reason that our relationship to misinformation has changed, along with the internet, is due to the post-truth era, which a lot of scholars think started in 2016. The Oxford Dictionary defines the post-truth era as a time when personal beliefs and emotions often outweigh facts or consensus in shaping opinion. This basically means that the way that information makes us feel is now more important and more relevant than whether or not it's true, accurate, or complete. We see this everywhere, in political campaigns that appeal to nostalgia or fear, in environmental messaging framed as moral duty, and in health discussions where personal horror stories overpower scientific evidence. Appealing to emotion is not new, and in fact most rhetoricians would probably claim it's an important part of being persuasive. But what I think is significant is that right now the scales have tipped. We're not necessarily seeing arguments that balance reason and emotion, but ones where emotional appeals eclipse informational ones. The effects of misinformation are profound. It causes fear and anxiety. It creates division and antagonism and mistrust. It means that emotions around decision making are heightened. One of the long-term effects of false information that I don't think we properly understand yet is that it's changing the way we communicate with one another. People use emotion and opinions over facts and reason when sharing ideas or making decisions. Confidence and popularity are trusted more than experience and education. Since we've become trapped in echo chambers, we only speak to like-minded audiences, so conversation becomes performative. We talk at one another, we don't talk with one another, in order to try and prove that we have the right kinds of ideas. I think that the constant presence of false information also creates an environment where it feels nearly impossible to make an informed decision. Today, a quick 10-minute search online can easily spiral into a confusing mix of information and strong emotions, especially when it comes to health topics. So before we start to talk about how to respond to false and misleading information, it's important to first define what we mean by misinformation and how it differs from related concepts like disinformation and fake news. We tend to use misinformation as an umbrella term to describe all different kinds of misleading information. However, as you can see from this visualization, the world of information and information exchange is actually quite a busy place. At the top, you can see we have fact or consensus, information that we have decided to agree on as a group, but everything below that falls into the category of what we often refer to as misinformation. Now, technically, misinformation is false information that's spread without malicious intent, while disinformation is deliberately created to deceive. Between these two is a messy middle. Malinformation sits between fact and disinformation and is a term that's used when real information gets used in the wrong context. Conspiracy theories and rumor arise when unverified information is used to solve a problem or a mystery. And finally, fake news, which was traditionally used to describe misleading journalism, but more recently it's used as a disparaging term designed to discredit all the media. In here we could also add satire, propaganda, and loads of other types of information that blur the line between fact and fiction. So why is it important to know the difference between all these different kinds of information? I'm not just splitting hairs because I work with words, but I think it does help to understand how false information can arise and spread, and it also lets us think about how we might respond. We'll talk about this more in the next part of the talk, But think about this as an example. Let's say I made a mistake and I told a friend that today's talk starts at 6:30 rather than 6. When they realize I made the mistake, they probably just come and correct me and say, you made a mistake, and I would say, I'm sorry. However, if I told my friend that the talk started at 8 because I didn't want them to come, I deliberately wanted them to walk in late, we would have a very different kind of conversation. And so it's really important to know why information is being spread and how it arises. To make sense of this whole world of information, scholars increasingly use broader phrases like disordered information or problematic information, meaning misleading, inappropriately attributed, or altogether fabricated. To me, these phrases feel a bit hard to use, especially in everyday conversation, and so I tend to use false information or misleading information to describe all of the bottom part of that diagram. So that's what you'll hear for the rest of the talk. So when we learn about all the different kinds of false messages and the different circumstances that lead to belief, we can start to understand some of the assumptions, concerns, and ideologies that lie behind false beliefs so that we can counter them effectively and sensitively. The most important thing to remember is that belief in false information is not necessarily due to stubborn ignorance or a lack of critical thinking. And in addition, belief in false information is not just a fringe phenomenon. Belief instead can reflect genuine concerns, social identities, personal histories, or a desire to belong to a particular worldview. For instance, vaccine hesitancy can stem from hearing a story from a friend or on social media, from a distrust of intellectual and media elites, or even from issues that may at first seem unrelated, like economic anxiety, or those connected to gender or race, age, or religion. Understanding this information requires us to understand people, our contexts, our values, and the conversations that shape us. So now that I've talked a lot about what false information is, how do we respond to it? If you do an internet search for ways of countering false information, the most popular results tend to be handy, easy to remember acronyms that help you to quickly check whether or not a piece of information is genuine or misleading. So these were the top 3 that popped up when I Googled them today. We have Sift, Flick, and ImVein, which is a bit awkward. But it was there at the top. Sift is a little tool that you can use that helps give you directions and helps you think about what you might do if you encounter a piece of false information. You would stop after reading the piece of information, you would investigate it further, you would try and find a better source to see if you can verify it, and then you could see if you could try and trace the claims that it's making. So it's really good if you're like, I'm not sure I believe this, what shall I do? Flick is a little bit different. Flick helps you to identify whether any of the kind of red flags of misinformation have arisen. Is there a fake expert, a logical fallacy, an impossible expectation, some cherry picking of evidence, or a conspiracy theory involved? If you find even one of those, you might be looking at a piece of false information. ImVein is the sort of opposite of Flick. It gives you some of the main characteristics of a verifiable, genuine piece of information. So if you can find that the source is independent, if there are multiple pieces of evidence cited, if it's verified, if it's authoritative, if it's informed, and if it's named, you're probably looking at a piece of information that you can maybe rely on. I think these are really great as quick tools if you have a concern about what you've encountered. So if you find something on the internet and you're like, not sure I feel good about this, you can use one of these tools to sort of check it out a bit more. But I've got 2 issues with this approach. One, you already need to be suspicious of the piece of information for this to work. So this is not going to work if it looks good. If it already looks good to you, you're not going to bother checking with one of these systems. Secondly, it puts an awful lot of pressure on individuals to be constantly on the alert for misleading facts. Saying that though, I recently heard about the approach, which is at the bottom here, frame check, don't just fact check, which I think is really, really useful. Checking the frame asks us to think about questions like, who is saying this? Why are they saying this? Who are they speaking to? What's in it for them? How are they saying this? What is it published in? And these kinds of frame checking questions are things that we can do that can be really, really helpful. They're not just help us identify whether something is a piece of false information, but maybe help us think about why it's being spread or who the person, or why the person is trying to spread it. Internet searches also bring up a lot of results. So after I Googled, how do I spot false information, misinformation, I came up with results about media literacy training. Again, I don't hate the suggestion. It's not a bad suggestion. But it's another example of pressure being put on individuals to solve the whole problem of false information when it's actually a wider problem that may be systemic or caused by larger bodies. I also think that media literacy education can often fall to people who are already very busy, like school teachers or people who work in libraries. Instead, I think media literacy is a subject that all educators can be concerned with. I really love the idea of health or PE teachers talking about fitness or nutrition advice that we see online. I really love the idea of a physics professor discussing how evidence-based science communication is essential to their work. I think if we share this work, it becomes more manageable and will, maybe more importantly, give our students a wider, a more real view of the topic. More widely, I think that these individual-based responses mask a bigger issue, which is that we have the right to clear, reliable, and accessible information. It's not just that we need to work harder to understand what's out there. Whatever responses we choose to make when encountering a misleading fact, we should also include a call for better information and better access to informational sources. So now that I've told you my doubts about Google's tip-top tips for combating misinformation, here is, I guess, where I am in my thinking about false information. The first point, I think people are always really disappointed to read and to hear. There isn't a best option. Lots and lots of research has been done comparing and looking at different kinds of responses to false information. And unfortunately, there isn't one really, really good thing that we can do to counter this issue. Secondly, and again related to this, and I've just been talking about it, individuals should not bear the burden of responding to false information. It should be something that we share, do collectively, or ask larger bodies to do on our behalf. Studies also show that we need a variety of different responses. So in the same way that one response doesn't work particularly well, if we do lots of different things, then that can have the most beneficial effect. Number 4, long-term structural reforms deserve more attention. These are hard to advocate for because they're often expensive, they're often difficult to put into practice, and they require a lot of people working on them over a long period of time. But nonetheless, I think these kinds of structural reforms are worth looking into. Number 5, platforms and tech can't be the sole focus. Often we look to social media companies, we look to other media companies, digital media companies, and I think that the problem of misinformation is wider. The problem of misinformation is not just about the internet, it's about how we're communicating with one another. And number 5, and this is the one that I've kind of most recently added to my list, generative AI is going to have complex effects. It's going to change misinformation, but I don't think it's a game changer. Again, misinformation is something bigger. It's something to do with how we communicate, how we've grown to mistrust one another, how we've come to talk with one another. So generative AI will complicate that, but it's not going to totally change everything. So, here we go. All right, so what can we do? I've made this grid, and I keep this grid on my computer, and every now and then I add to it. So you're actually seeing research in action here, which is very exciting. But this grid helps me to think about all of these different issues. How do we organize ourselves so that we have a range of different responses to misinformation, but we don't place all of the burden of responding to misinformation on one person or one body? As you can see, down the left, I've divided approaches into ones that can be carried out by individuals and those that should maybe be the responsibilities of groups, institutions, or larger organizations. And across the top, you can see that I've organized the responses into when we should engage in this activity, whether we should prepare for encountering misleading information in advance, which is called pre-bunking, or whether we need to respond and correct after we've seen it. So as I said, this helps me make sure that I'm spreading the labor and also spreading the timing of these responses so they can be used most effectively. So if we start in this top left box, this is a list of things that we can do as individuals before we even encounter any false information. So I like to think of this as kind of best practices that we can all do to minimize the presence and the threat of misleading information in our lives. and to generally prioritize wide, various, and authentic communication. So be transparent and trustworthy. So in our communications, make sure that we are talking about where our information is from, where we're seeing ideas, when we have concerns about our ideas. Seek out and amplify a range of informational sources. I'm guilty of not doing this. I tend to go to the same newspaper when I want information. I listen to the same radio station. But we should try and listen to a range of different sources when we're looking for information. Don't just always go back to the same things. Look at different things. If you are a person who likes sharing things on the internet, share stuff from lots of different sources. Have lots of voices represented on your social media feeds. Support local media. So this one is really interesting to me. I recently read an article that was suggesting that supporting and maybe even reviving local journalism can be an interesting solution to misinformation. There's strong evidence that the decline of local news outlets, especially newspapers, has eroded civic engagement, knowledge, and trust. So I really like the idea of a media outlet created by and for local communities that focuses on the information that directly impacts us. We're really lucky in Rochester. I think we have a really strong tradition of local media, and so I'm curious to think about how this could maybe evolve and grow. I'm a millennial. I still think fondly of newspapers. I don't think Gen Z do. I don't think Gen Alpha will. So what do they want? So I'm really curious to hear about what local journalism, what local media could look like in the near and sort of medium future. But I do believe that it could be a place where we could kind of re-engage ourselves as communities and share information that's actually useful to us. I mean, and I'm even thinking about things like, do you remember going to the newspaper for things like movie times or the weather, listening to the radio if you wanted to know the traffic? And these things, I think, could really restore some sense of community feeling amongst us. Finally, get involved in community events. Hooray, we've all done it. We're all here in a community event. So again, I think re-engaging civically, re-engaging with each other, meeting people face to face and hearing what they have to say can be a really wonderful way of making sure that our communication practices are authentic and clear. Next, we have institutions. What can they do to kind of pre-bunk? I think engaging in official pre-bunking, this can often be hard, but I think if a body or an institution knows that some kind of misinformation about something that they're about to do could arise, I think addressing that can be really, really interesting. I'm looking forward to hearing more perhaps about things like vaccine season when we're all getting our flu shots. Can we engage in kind of pre-bunking? Can we anticipate some concerns that people might have? Media literacy and critical thinking skills, these can be baked into a lot of communications. Improving access to informational sources. No gatekeeping. Don't keep information kind of behind so many paywalls. Make sure that people can have access to information if you're publishing it, making sure it gets out there and people can actually read it. Organizations have more power than individuals. They can lobby social media organizations, media outlets, government reps to talk to them about how we are concerned about false messages getting out there. Supporting research. This is a really important one. If people are doing good research, let's support it and let's communicate it. Let's tell people about it. And finally, increase cybersecurity. This is one that I've recently added, but I've been thinking a lot about how cybersecurity can also affect what's being put on the internet. So can we have rigorous controls that can help control that more? On the right-hand side, we now have what do we do after? So hopefully, if all of these pre-bunking activities, if we've kind of taken care of them well, hopefully reactive and corrective strategies will have to happen less. But when they do, the second half of the table has some ideas and some best practices for countering false information so that we can identify and address it both on an individual and a community level. So for individuals, these evaluative tools that I just were talking about can be really, really helpful. If you see something that seems a bit dodgy, remember you have these tools at your disposal to help kind of check them. Fact check and frame check. Correct, don't just debunk. This is one that I suggest with a lot of caution attached to it. It can often be difficult to wander around kind of correcting people. But studies show that when we just debunk information, when we just say that's not right and then move on, it doesn't have any effect. Learn context. Why does a person believe in this particular conspiracy theory or piece of misinformation? Acknowledge their concerns, talk, don't lecture, and address information, not ideology. So really focusing on the individual, their individual concerns is something that I think we can all do as humans. Collective corrective responses. What can larger bodies do? Report social media organizations and media outlets that don't seem like they're adhering to some of the strict standards that we expect of them. And again, some of these other ideas, correcting, not just debunking, and offer alternative resources. I think large bodies, organizations, institutions have opportunities to offer alternative resources to people so that they're not just on the internet looking for disinformation. So to finish, I just want to kind of go back to where I started with the idea of talking together as a community. I think that misinformation thrives in silence and in isolation and in the absence of trust. But when we gather together, as we're doing now, to talk openly, to share perspectives and question respectfully, that is the most important thing that we can do to counter misinformation. We can begin to rebuild the social bonds that misinformation tries to break apart. And I really do believe that when we come together as a group to solve a problem, we have more potential than if we're on our own just scrolling social media. By thinking collectively, we can take an important step towards reclaiming control of our public conversations and the health of our communities. Thank you very much.
Share his piece.
We have some time for questions at the end, is that correct? Yes? Okay. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for this opportunity to share. And I'm really thankful to your bibliography, all right. I'm very, very thankful to the Academy of Medicine. I always love coming to this space. This is just such a wonderful space. I've been at multiple meetings here, but I always enjoy coming back. So really thank you for hosting us tonight. And thank you to my colleague and friend, Dr. Ray-Ellen Cavey, for inviting me to be here and for all of her wonderful work. So I'm excited to be in this space, excited to be with you. Before I do that, I will say one other thing. As a physician, I'm supposed to give disclosures, and I'm supposed to have a slide, which I don't have. But I will say that I don't take any money from pharmaceutical companies or from insurance companies or from medical device manufacturers. So just to make sure you know that, there are no ties. I am representing the views of the American Academy of Family Physicians. Nothing I say is in contrast to their views. I am the president of the Monroe County Medical Society. I'm not directly representing their views tonight. So just full disclosure. So I'm going to start with the good, the bad, and the ugly. So these are some unfortunate examples of how disinformation really plays out in the clinical world. So I will talk a little bit about MMR vaccine later, but COVID vaccine and pregnancy. So COVID-19 is strongly associated with stillbirth. It is also associated with maternal hospitalization and severe complications, as is flu. We have unfortunately been very much victims in the maternity care world to disinformation in this realm, and we have unfortunately seen stillbirths and preterm births that are associated with COVID. It is highly preventable, and there are several good studies demonstrating that, so really unfortunate. Tylenol, this recent article that I'm sure many of you have heard about. So fever in pregnancy is associated with birth defects, miscarriage, and preterm labor. We want patients in the first trimester especially to talk to us immediately when they've got a fever, anytime in pregnancy they've got a fever. But some of these fevers are not explained. It may just be a cold, but there is still an association with miscarriage. So there is really no harm. I will say based on multiple studies, Tylenol is very safe in pregnancy, but there is some mis or disinformation going around about that. Again, very unfortunate. And then, my oncologist colleagues asked me to bring this up tonight to make people are aware of this one. So ivermectin has been, the oncologists are seeing people come in asking for ivermectin. I can understand why there's so much out there on the internet about ivermectin. But unfortunately, ivermectin is an anti-parasite drug. It has no role in cancer treatment or prevention. And they are seeing some patients have really severe complications and death from refusing chemotherapy and radiation therapy and instead wanting ivermectin. And then the last one I'll put out for now, this is kind of my own observation that if you ask any primary care physician about Dunkin' Donuts, we're going to tell you stay away, drink the coffee and nothing else. But Dunkin' Donuts will tell you that their food is nutritious and healthy. So I think there's a lot from the food industry in many places that there's, I don't know if that's mis or disinformation, but of course a lot of Americans think that ultra processed foods and carbohydrates, processed carbs are good for us and they're actually quite bad for us, but yeah. So I have very few slides, but I'm a very visual thinker, so I don't know about you, but it helps me to sort of see this on a slide. So the principles that when physicians and clinician organizations talk about how we frame the world, we really start with the Hippocratic Oath and the principles of medical ethics. So number one is autonomy, just respecting a person's individual choices. And then beneficence and non-maleficence. So do good, but do no harm. So don't recommend a medication where the harms may outweigh the benefits or there's a high risk of harm. And then lastly, justice, so that all patients are treated fairly and equally. And then going beyond the medical ethics principles, when we talk about making clinical guidelines, so there are multiple kinds of research studies that we use, and we use these in combination. But I just wanted to run through these really quickly. So the ones in purple first. So a cohort study is where you follow a group of people over a period of maybe many years, maybe a shorter amount of time, but you try to distinguish what's different about those two groups and how their health outcomes and try to look at differences and what makes them have different health outcomes. And then a case control is where it's sort of like that cohort, but where one group has a medical condition, the other doesn't. And you try to look at observationally what might be those differences and make some inferences. But these are generally looked at, they're retrospective, so things happened, you're observing what happened in the past. So you can only draw limited conclusions. You can't draw causality from that. And then cross-sectional studies are where you sort of follow like a population and try to tease out information from that population. But again, it's more retrospective. And then, so in the gold standard, what a lot of physician organizations think of as the gold standard are randomized controlled trials, where you have one group that got this medical intervention, whether a medication, a surgery, whatever, and another group that did not, and then they're followed over X amount of time. Ideally, they are put into those groups without, so the study researchers are blinded, they don't know which group got which intervention, and also they're randomized so that there were multiple people with various characteristics in this group and that group. So there's that randomization is supposed to account for real life. So when you make medical guidelines, RCTs are thought of as like the gold standard, but the reality is that all these types of studies are important, and we try to account for all of it because some will give you different kinds of information. And then lastly, qualitative research, many medical journals don't like it. They think it's too subjective. But I will tell you, like in the maternal mortality world, we're really leaning into qualitative studies because we can look at racism in maternity care. We can look at how patients perceive the health system, why they choose to come late in pregnancy to medical care, that kind of stuff. So that is, and I'm just throwing pregnancy as an example, but the qualitative studies are really important in medical research, and they're really rich, and they can help put a lens on all this other stuff. So I think they're really important. And then I I won't go through this very busy slide in detail, but my point in throwing this up here is that we use all these kinds of, these various kinds of studies, and we try to synthesize them. So most major medical organizations like the American College of Cardiology or the American Congress of OBGYN, they have multiple clinical guidelines. So they do these things they call evidence reviews, and then they create a clinical practice guideline for doctors to use, but these can be put out into the public. So when you think about vaccine recommendations, they're based on these kinds of reviews. So we use multiple types of studies and these committees that review these studies in great rigor and great detail. I served as chair of one of these committees in 2020. I feel really confident about the process having done that. It was a really scary and horrible time, but to see the process and how it worked was really tremendous. And I also will say, at least, so my own organization, the American Academy of Family Physicians, we also, the people that do these guidelines, the committee is made up of people of multiracial, multi-age, rural, urban, suburban, coming from various parts of the country. So all those things go into play so that we're really representative of the public, and not just physicians, but the public as we develop these guidelines. So I think that's really important to know. I guess I'm saying that this is how we combat disinformation, or we try to get real science-based information out into the world. And then this is sort of an example. So in 1998, Dr. Andrew Wakefield published a study of 12 cases. And in the Lancet, which is a really prestigious British medical journal, tried to draw some kind of conclusion that there was a tie to the MMR vaccine, despite that some of the kids actually had symptoms of autism before the vaccine. But drew this conclusion that MMR was linked to autism somehow. This got out into the world. It fueled multiple waves of anti-vaccine sentiment, especially among parents and the public. In 2010, the Lancet retracted this article. They actually found evidence that he was accepting money from lawyers who were trying to sue parents in 1990, trying to sue the vaccine manufacturers in 1998. He was chastised by the Royal Medical Society. I don't know if he lost his membership, but he was harshly chastised. So when I went through those ethical principles at the beginning, it's an example of violation of all those ethical principles. We have really strong evidence for MMR vaccine safety, and multiple studies before and after this study demonstrating the safety and efficacy of vaccines for children, MMR being one of the most important, actually. So I think I will stop there for now and turn it over to my colleague.
So I was mainly asked as a physician to come talk about my experiences working in healthcare and working as a physician and combating medical misinformation. I think the COVID pandemic was a very new experience having to deal with medical misinformation. I don't think I was actually prepared for the amount of medical misinformation that was going to be thrown at me as a physician. And it was a difficult time, and I had to definitely learn how to empathize with patients, because when I was a resident, one of the big things that you do during your residency is you spend years learning how to interpret medical literature, and it's not easy. And medical residents are individuals that went through undergrad, they went through medical school, and it's still not easy for them to interpret the literature. So, so I can understand that sometimes interpreting information out there in different, articles and whatnot is going to be a challenge. But what I wasn't prepared for was when, I identified myself as a physician, and it was like, oh, you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. And it was easy to get defensive during those moments, but then I also had to realize that I still had a job to do, and it was still to educate my patients. And so it was important that I met them where they were. it also helped that I understood where conspiracy theories, I think, originate from. And in my own opinion, I think conspiracy theories are a defense mechanism. And I think what happens is when there's something scary going on or something very difficult to understand, it's easier to assume that it's made up or that it's a conspiracy theory. And when I started looking at it from that perspective, I at least was able to have a little bit more compassion for some of the conspiracy theorists. And some were different than others, you know. But I think that when I encountered patients that had very strong conspiracy theory beliefs, it helped if I could start chipping away at, you know, maybe where it originated from. And so I first wanted to understand, well, what is their background? What is their background educationally? You know, what are their strengths, weaknesses? Where maybe would they be susceptible to, you know, falling for certain conspiracies? But I think what was difficult was that I'm just one person. So when I was encountering a patient that maybe listened to 20 or 30 different conspiracy theorists on social media, and now I'm saying literally the antithesis to what they've just listened to for months, I look like I don't know what I'm talking about. I look like the conspiracy theorist, and that was difficult. And so I would often, so you have no idea how much time I spent watching all of the conspiracy theory videos that patients would bring to me. So if you went to my Google, you would probably think that I was a conspiracy theorist. But it helped, and there was even what was scary was that, you know, there was the obvious videos that you would watch, and you're like, okay, this person is making this video out of their basement. They have no credentials whatsoever. Those were easier to disprove. The more difficult ones to contradict were the ones that looked really professional. There was a video, I mean, there was a whole video put out. I think it was An Inconvenient Truth, or I forget the title of it. It was a catchy one. And it was about, you know, all these anti-vaxxers and, you know, giving very convincing sounding information. It was so extraordinarily difficult to combat that. So if you know, one of the things that I developed in my practice was kind of having these pre-arguments of how I could approach things or to put things into perspective. Because once I could maybe put into perspective that, you know, these people that you're watching have no vested interest in you at all. They have no legal or ethical obligation, but I do as your physician. Please listen to me, for the love of God. By the way, I get paid the way either way. But you know, sometimes that worked. Sometimes meeting them where they were, or sometimes letting them know that I was familiar with the particular author of the conspiracy theory that they were referencing sometimes helped. And sometimes I was successful and sometimes I wasn't. And if you think that I had any more credibility with my own family or friends, it was probably even worse. You know, I was once told that you know, the fastest way to not, you know, get someone to take your advice is by giving it for free, and that was a very rude awakening. I remember my aunt, you know, she's like, I was talking to my hairdresser and she said that this was really not a safe thing to take. And I was like, oh, so your hairdresser went to medical school and she's a doctor and whatnot? She's like, no, but she knows, she talked to someone. So the other thing that I think was difficult for patients is the amount of experts out there. You know, when I look at some of the social media influencers, I quickly realize that when someone just puts the title doctor in front of their name, but they have no other credentials after it, they're not a medical doctor. Almost never are they a medical doctor. And the reason I think that was important in terms of medical advice is I want to know the person giving me advice is actually a medical doctor. And there's a lot of pseudoscientists out there that, man, they sound good and they do have the doctor title, but it doesn't mean they're actually a medical doctor. And so sometimes I advise my patients, if someone's a medical physician, you can easily Google them, look them up, find if they're licensed to practice medicine, what their specialty is. So sometimes that due diligence is really important. But it was incredible to watch. So I worked when it was COVID. I worked on a COVID-only floor for 6 months. I also did ICU level care for a number of months. And you're watching people die every day, or people that are getting very, very sick. And to me, this was, absolutely horrifying. And so when the vaccine came out, I was, the first one that was like rolling up my sleeve to get it. And I thought, if only patients and the public knew what I know or saw what I saw, they would, of course, be lining up in droves to get this vaccine. What was hard, though, and, some of our safeguards, I think, that we normally had where you could rely on were compromised. Normally, there's, and at least throughout my lifetime, the medical community and our elected officials were kind of on the same page about a lot of things. And I think COVID was that first time that we saw a disconnect. And that was unusual. And even more presently, I think, a lot of times people will ask me, what can I reference to obtain, to read about certain things. And it used to always be, just go to the CDC's website. It's all right there. What's concerning now is that I'm feeling I can do that less and less and less. And so now the breeding ground of conspiracy theories is quite vibrant, because now not only am I saying something, but I can't always guarantee that what's going to be listed on the CDC is going to line up with what I'm saying. And now I'm telling you to listen to me and not the CDC. So as physicians, it has gotten quite difficult. And I think we're in somewhat uncharted territory, which is why I think it's so important that, we kind of go back, and it's to look at information we're getting online and try to be as objective as possible. The other thing, too, is probably everyone in this room is already doing that. Probably the people that aren't doing that are not in this room, unfortunately. So I think it requires, as what I can do as a physician is have at least a little bit of humility when I'm encountering patients with different conspiracy theories. And I think we all can do that, though. Because it's easy when you hear someone say, hey, have you heard that if you take Tylenol, your child's going to get autism? They're like, oh my gosh, you're an idiot. Like, clearly not. No, that's clearly not true. But that's not what you're supposed to do. So, I think that we can all help educate each other. And I think what happens is that it used to be that if you before the internet, you lived in a community and there was maybe one conspiracy theorist per village. And now the entire internet has given them all a platform. So there's now there's relative to the United States population, 1 million people isn't a lot. But when 1 million people that all have the same conspiracy theory say that, hey, there's 1 million other people just like me, and we're all able to connect immediately, it makes it very difficult to combat that. And so I think sometimes when we encounter loved ones or family that are, in our lives that have certain conspiracy theories, to just kind of remind them that, hey, no, that's not actually, maybe to have a discussion. Sometimes that helps. Doesn't always. But this is a unique time, I think, to be working in healthcare. But those are just some of my experiences. So, yeah.
Thank you very much to our panelists. They did a wonderful job and they stayed on task, giving us plenty of time for questions from the audience, from our community here. I wanted to just first open it up. I'm so glad, Dr. Whitebell, that you put the part about generative AI at the end of one of your slides, and it was a recent addition to your slide. But what really stands out to me is just how much it itself hallucinates with information and taking information from all of these different sources, which is loaded with misinformation or disinformation. And so, I agree it's not going to fundamentally change the landscape, but do you think that, or do you have any thoughts about how it may confuse more people, or as it relates to, how we think that machines might be smarter than us? Are they taking us over? All of these things. Do you have any thoughts or reflections on that as it relates to your work?
Thank you. Yes, I think the thing about generative AI, I think that scares me the most is the way that it can generate images. I think when we see visual evidence, we're very inclined to believe it. So I think that when we see a photograph, we often maybe want to believe it more quickly than we might want to believe some text. So I think one of my very real fears is people starting to use generated images to stand in as evidence for their claims and their arguments. So I think that's where I see it being a big threat. The point you're making though about hallucinations, I do wonder, because when I talk to my students, they seem very aware that generative AI can make mistakes and is not always accurate and can kind of make stuff up. And so I do feel very hopeful. I do feel very hopeful that there are lots of people who don't just believe that everything it says is true. But yeah, as I said, the image is the thing that really frightens me, the fake image, the fake video that might be used as evidence to support fake information.
All right, let's open it up to the audience. Questions? Yes.
Hi, I just had a question for those in the medical field. You mentioned about the importance of credentialing. Is there any role that you feel for those that are maybe on medical boards, societies, licensure? Because there are people that do have credentials after their name that have no problem saying things which are generally accepted as not being correct or accurate. Or they will find maybe the one example out of a study of 1,000, right? And they'll say, sample size 1, that will be enough, and they will use that to share that information with, folks that they're counseling. I'm just wondering what role is there for there to be some sort of action, because if they are part of a society and they do have certain professional standards, aren't we as a members of the community relying on the others to speak up and to say this is not okay?
Great question.
That's a very good question, because there are certainly outliers within the medical community that have very obscure views, which usually, when you a lot of the times with those individuals, not always, they're usually trying to sell some sort of product. There's usually something that they're trying to push. And so the moment someone's maybe over-representing something, or maybe trying to push a product and their name's on the bottle, that's usually the first red flag. But a lot of the times, too, is you want to ask the question, is this person actually practicing medicine? Sometimes there are individuals that have certain credentials, but they're not actually in the field practicing. They might not even be board certified. They might not even hold a medical license of any sort. So sometimes verifying those credentials too, I think is really important. And to be honest, I think that people that have that knowledge and that those certain credentials that are pushing forth misinformation, I think it's one of the worst things you can do. But usually they're trying to sell a product of some sort or have some conflict of interest that you can look for.
I think it's unfortunate that for a physician to be challenged by a medical society, they have to really have a pretty gross ethical violation of one of those principles I put up there. So unfortunately, you can present some pretty bad misinformation without being chastised by the medical society or whatever. But one thing that you can do, if something feels suspicious to you as a member of the public or a consumer of healthcare, you can Google American Heart Association guidelines on high blood pressure, or you can Google American Medical Association, whatever, on multiple topics. And if something sounds fishy to you, you can go to that physician, whoever, and be like, hey, this isn't, because we have these really strong evidence-based guidelines in multiple areas, and it's very okay to challenge a physician around this.
Yeah, and actually that's a really good point too, where you should be able to challenge your physician and have a dialogue. And I think depending on their response also is a good, indicator of how they are.
Yes.
Dr. Taramasco mentioned that he had reviewed a lot of conspiracy theories. I'm just wondering if you've had a chance to actually make a list of credible podcasts and speakers on certain subject and offer this to your patients sort of as a way to counter the conspiracy theories.
Great question. So, countering it with other big voices.
Gosh, unfortunately, I wish I could say that I found equally as many very credible sources. I didn't. I would often refer to established medical society websites, so the American Heart Association, the ADA. I would kind of bring the patient back to those areas. Unfortunately, for every, there were maybe, I never had watched an influencer or a social media influencer that I could say I would definitely refer my patients to consistently. So I didn't. So I felt like, because I'm also taking the responsibility, if I refer someone to a certain media influencer, that everything they're saying is accurate. And because I didn't have the time to watch every video, I'm like, I don't know. What about you?
I don't know. Podcasts are tricky. They're really tricky, but Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic, if you're just trying to I was just diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, if you go on one of those or just Google Cleveland Clinic rheumatoid arthritis, that they're very reliable. I would highly recommend those two in particular.
Well, I changed my question now, but.
Okay. Go ahead.
I'm just a retired NP, and I'm so retired that it's hard for me to remember things, but I loved NIH because, and the funding for that, I hope it's back, but I'm not sure it is, but they're unbiased, and they tell you when they don't know. And those two things mean so much to me, because then I believe what I'm able to read through it. And then I go look on Mayo Clinic and other universities to back it up before I talk about a topic. And that helps me. And I also tell people that that's what I've done. But one of the words that is missing up here when you were talking about disinformation is, I think it's sensationalism. They seem to have to do better than. Everybody does, even I do. I want to say my talk is the best talk in the world, but nobody's going to listen to that. But on TV they do. This medicine is the best. This is the best information. This is the best president. This is the best RFK. And I have a little problem with all of that, because it makes me so angry that I can't keep my voice down. And before this political arena that has newly arrived, I could keep quiet.
Who wants to take that one?
It wasn't really a question.
Response?
I can say something. No, I love this point about sensationalism. I think there is, and again, it's something with social media, because there are so many competing voices. We have to be the one saying, I'm the best, I'm the biggest, I'm the greatest. And so I like that. I would like to add that in and say this is also changing the way we communicate. We're trying to be the biggest and the best and the brightest. I agree with that. Can I ask a quick question, thinking about sending people for further information places? Is there anywhere that you can think of that is reliable, that I think offers information in using different media, so maybe videos. If you went to the Cleveland Clinic website, is there a space where you can maybe look at a video or listen to some audio? And also, is there any way you can think of that maybe has things like patient testimony or interviews between physicians and patients? Because I think kind of diversifying the way that we receive information in these kinds of resources could be really good. Like, I would love to watch a video from a patient saying, yeah, I took this medication and this is kind of what it was like. That would feel like a really good way of receiving information. Is there anything like that?
I think the tricky thing is that the healthcare enterprise is so focused on just getting people care, and now we're so underfunded.
Yes.
And so for us to think about social media and like putting out a public facing, like that's so hard because all we can do is like get people care right now as people are losing insurance. And so we face that constant struggle, right? I think that's a great gap that is something we should learn to do better as a healthcare
who's gonna do
system. Yeah.
I mean, there are some doctors on YouTube that are actually pretty good. Dr. Mike, Mama Dr. Jones, Rena Malik, MD, they have their own kind of following and do their best to do exactly what you're doing, but also on sort of a grander scale. From a medical perspective, using evidence-based, providing citations in their videos and their descriptions, so hopefully people can go check them. and they've been very quick to say, a respondent said that I said something and I want to correct myself. So they're very humble in that regard. So that's at least some good news. Yes.
I'd like to make some comments, sort of reflecting on what you just said. I wonder whether there is some sort. Yeah, I wonder whether there is a deeper issue here that we are not really facing. And I think it comes back to the fact that we live in an extremely complex society, right? Where information in many ways is inherently unreliable. Let me give you an example. For example, when you look at scientific studies, right, we sort of think that if something underwent peer review, it is now sort of become the corpus of knowledge that is reliable. However, it has been shown that a large number of original publications are not actually reproducible. Something up to nearly a third or so are actually not reproducible. Why is that? Well, obviously, I'm not talking about fabrications. I'm just talking about the fact that in many times when someone does an experiment, there is a limited amount of knowledge that is generated, and that knowledge is often extrapolated by the investigators themselves. Now, that extrapolation may be true or may not be true on the long run. And because there are so many studies now, I think it is almost unavoidable that very well-intentioned people will generate false information. So this is one comment I wanted to make. The second comment is that I think that misinformation is also very common when there is lack of information, right? For example, I actually just learned yesterday that tuberculosis, right, very, very well-known disease, in the first half of the 19th century, there were really two major thoughts about that, what tuberculosis is. What. The majority of people thought that tuberculosis is an inherited disease. But there was a small minority, for example, some smaller states in present-day Italy, that it actually considered it as an infectious disease, right? So two diabolically opposed views on a phenomenon. Both of them lacked both of them had very, very limited data, right? It was not only until the 1880s that tuberculosis was actually sort of clarified what it is. So these are just two things, and I think that there is something really deep here that really explains why is this what we call misinformation And I think that we really have to go beyond just the sort of current political situation, things like that. I think there's something very much deeper that reflects on the complexity of our really modern society.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that before our next question, or? Yeah, sure.
I really agree with that point, and I'd really like to say something about consensus, which I think is a really important word. I think we need to remember that when we reach consensus, we've basically agreed as a group that whatever it is we've been talking about is what we're going to do, is going to guide our behavior, is going to be at the center of our knowledge. I often say to my students, if we jumped in a time machine and went back to the year 850 and someone said the Earth is flat, we shouldn't be shocked. We should just be like, yeah, that's what they think. That's fine. There we go. But I think something has happened, and I don't know why, and I don't quite know how to articulate it. But we've lost the agreement of consensus. We've lost the ability somehow to say, yes, as a community, we're just going to agree that this is how it is, and this is what we're going to do. I don't know if it's because there's too many egos in the room. I don't know if it's because of this sort of sensationalist thing where everyone wants to be the loudest voice. But somehow, somewhere, we've lost this gentlemanly agreement where we're all saying, I think it's good to get vaccinated. And I think that is the deeper thing that you're talking about. I think it's a really great point. I don't know how we can get that back.
So I don't know if you really addressed this, but one of the things that I find that when patients ask me about something, that they don't trust scientists because scientists change their mind. But when I sit down and I explain that science is a process of evaluating and reevaluating and seeking truth, that things will change, that the old wives' tale of running in the rain is going to make you sick, when we actually found out that when it's cold, you lose some immune capabilities because the cilia in your nose, they don't function as well. So actually, it's true. So, but it's everything, how do we get that trust back again? I think that's really it. I was literally arguing with my niece over a picture of a woman who had supposedly gotten 12 vaccines and looked horrific. And it was an AI-generated image, and you could not change her mind on that this was no way near the truth. It's just, I don't know what to do. It's a lot of moral distrust there.
Evolving landscape of science.
Yeah, I actually meant to mention that tonight, that I think that is a constant tension that I feel as a clinician, that I know that science is dynamic and it's going to change. Even in my medical career, I saw us recommending postmenopausal hormones and then disrecommending them and now recommending them again, and this for hypertension, this not for hypertension, and absolutely. But that's when, and medicine is a merger of science and ethics, right? And it's all of that wrapped up together, and somehow you have to put the science and the ethics and justice all in one and make it work. But I do think that the more that we have free and accessible public education and help people understand what science is, among other things, that people can think freely for themselves, but understand how to interpret science for themselves, and somehow not trust the internet so much, but trust the scientific method. And if we can teach that in schools, I'm hopeful that that helps combat disinformation to some extent.
So, as what I often sometimes find myself explaining to patients is that, if you could just read all the literature out there and you could practice medicine, after just reading the literature, you know, unfortunately, it's much more complicated than that. And so I explained that I'm merging the body of literature and evidence and my understanding of, you know, the basic sciences that I learned in medical school. And you're kind of finding where they meet up. And when the literature doesn't answer my question, or I don't feel that it gives me the correct answer, I tend to rely on my knowledge of the basic sciences and apply that to the patient. And I think I also frequently remind patients that it is complicated. You know, it took me years before I felt I could go through a journal article and pick it apart and take away from it what I actually needed to. So if it was hard for me after years of training, it must be extremely intimidating for patients. But it's sometimes difficult to even have that conversation, to even get those, you know, to even have that dialogue sometimes. So it is frustrating.
One quick reflection. So I was a bioethicist on Long Island during 2020, the epicenter of COVID-19, where we were actively allocating ventilators and critical care resources to people. And I recall one story where a patient who did have COVID pneumonia was diagnosed and screened and tested twice, and he would not accept it. He would not accept a ventilator. He said, "I am not dying." He was actively in respiratory failure, and he said, "This is not COVID. I'm going to get better. You are all wrong." And of course, he died. So he held that until his dying breath. And that just shows, to the point that you had made back there, and to what Laura was talking about it all kind of comes together as like how deeply rooted misinformation can be, that somebody is willing to die for their belief system. And now that's not new, like people have died for their belief system forever. But the point is that we have evidence, we have diagnostic tests, we did it twice. We even had family trying to plead with him, just get intubated, but he wouldn't. And so again, like this could be the difference between life and death for some, but it could also be health and illness, and it can be how you form relationships with people. So it just brought up that memory for me. So thank you, and I don't like you for doing that, but thank you so much. Yes, I'll come back to you.
Thank you. So, so people can make mistakes, right? So even the experts can make mistakes. So I would like your comment on, especially as medical practitioners, you know, doctors have made mistakes, nurses have made mistakes, and in the public opinion, there are people who distrust, you know, even people that we would consider experts in the field. So how do you, you know, rectify that reality and you know, the reputation loss from that kind of thing?
Great question.
So I don't know if I have the perfect answer for you. You know, I appreciate very much that when I have a patient that, so I work in a hospital. I work on patients that are admitted to the hospital. So unlike my primary care colleagues, patients aren't necessarily choosing me to be their doctor. I'm kind of the doctor that's there that week. So I appreciate the fact that when I walk into their room that they're putting a lot of trust in me at that moment. And I think to combat that, you have to build that level of trust with the patient. Unfortunately, I don't follow my patients for years and years and years, so I have to build that trust really quickly. And I do that by explaining to them their illness in a way that they understand so that they can make their own decisions. When I was in medical school, my professor always had told us, your job as a physician is to explain to your patient their illness or their disease in such a way that they understand it as well as you do and can make their own decisions. And that's really difficult. Now do that in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. and I think I have it better than primary care because I mean, because I don't have patients waiting for me and in succession. I can kind of allocate my time throughout the day, but the way to build that trust is to make sure that they are understanding their illness. The nurses on my floors always tell me they know which rooms are mine because the whiteboards, which are supposed to be like goals of the day, I erase and I draw pictures because I think they're far more effective. But I try multiple different strategies to get them to understand what's going on. And when I do that and relate to them in some way and build that relationship, that helps. How can we do that as a community? That's way more difficult. That's way more difficult.
Yeah, I think that was.
Great.
Hi. One question I had, I'm thinking, in a lot of this conversation, we have this assumption that that everyone's a rational actor, like the patient's there, and it's about false or true, and I don't know if this is just, how my feeds that I see, but when I see some of that stuff concerning health, it's always adjacent to these like lifestyle, these like trends, and it'll be I don't know, you got to eat 300 grams of protein, or and then there's stuff that goes on from that. There's usually an assumption about things, and then I've known people who are maybe in a very certain kind of diet styles like keto, and they often will go into, again, that stuff's all adjacent to it, the opinions about vaccines and things like that. And I was just wondering if that is something you see, or if that is a minority and most people are just like kind of not so attached to those kind of cultural trends, I guess.
Okay, so so I mean, we as physicians, we're humans too. Boy, I wish there was a protein powder or a supplement or something that I could take that would make me, very healthy and in shape and, live to be 100. The reality is that there isn't. And, what's interesting is I love when I watch someone that's trying to advertise or, advocate for a certain supplement or product or whatever. And they first go in and bash the medical system and how we're all out to make money on, drugs and whatever. And then on the next breath, they're like, so we're going to sell you this. Yeah, we're going to sell you this product that has never stood the test of science whatsoever. And then you're going to have to use it the rest of your life. So I personally, when I watch some of that information, I chuckle because it's so deceptive. But also there have been some studies on, creatine supplementation and protein supplements and vitamins, and what the literature shows is they make no difference. But there isn't a lot of information on it out there because it's not something that's, well funded to study. But just know that I think what I remind my patients and the public is that just know you're engaging in something that has not been verified by any independent source, usually.
And I think you reminded me that what I often recommend to people, well, I just mention to people that if someone's like an influencer or on the kinds of things you're referring to, they're usually benefiting personally in some way by being on there, whether it's the clicks or the likes or the money. The American Medical Association, the American Heart Association, when they put out guidelines for the public, they're not making money. They're actually losing money to do that. So they're doing it for altruistic reasons. So that's why I would kind of trust those sources that are more organizations than individuals.
You kind of hinted at a program that we're going to have in June on supplements, about sort of something like this. We have time for maybe one more question.
You have many people that are in high influence and convey to the public on many media what's considered to be misinformation and disinformation. I'm really curious why these people in very high places, what's their end goal? What's the game going to be, and how soon?
Great question. Great question to end this program on. I'm going to turn this to Laura. Read their minds.
Yeah, that's a great question. We've talked a little bit, my colleagues here have talked about kind of financial gain. I'm selling this product. So I think that that's a big one. Financial gain can help. I think I hate to say it, but I think there are people who just want to be disruptive and kind of chaotic. I think there is sometimes a great delight in kind of getting at, intellectual elites and saying, I know better than you, I'm going to disrupt this organization that's been in place. They want to be sensational. Yeah, I mean, and that is kind of true. Everyone wants to be a star. So, yeah, wanting to spread disinformation in that way. I'm thinking more widely about false information, but it can have political benefit to spread false information about individuals. It can have a benefit in terms of business as well, spreading information about individuals to kind of undermine how people feel about them. So there are lots and lots of reasons for people wanting to do that. I would say financial gain, power, and the sort of chaos of disrupting the system.
All right. So on that note, do you? Yes, of course.
So here's one of the, I realize you said that for colleagues, it is difficult to discipline them, for lack of a better word. But when I saw in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, a group of physicians that were spewing clear mis and disinformation, there was no negative consequence for that type of an action. And I felt it was extremely hurtful to our profession, along with everything else that's going on, obviously. Do you have any comments on that?
There was a ton of, and I don't know, maybe the physician organizations did not do this well, I'll be honest, that in terms of being as public facing as we could have, there was a ton of information coming from like the AMA, the American Academy of Family Physicians, to other clinical people, doctors, nurses, et cetera, that we had town halls almost every night for many months to get like true scientific information out there within the medical community. So I very much know that there was that. Did we do that well for the public? I'm not sure.
And in terms of, I guess, reprimanding the bad apples, I think it's difficult to do because, and unfortunately, I don't know what the right answer is for that. I think it again goes to consensus. The large bodies of medical societies were on the same page, but that was very frustrating during the pandemic.
Because they would cause patient harm.
Yeah,
and that, to me, is like malpractice.
Yeah.
So that was extremely upsetting that was not addressed.
Okay, on that note, thank you so much, everybody. Thank our panelists. Please be on the lookout for our future programming, and if you do have time to take our survey, tell us about this program, other future programs, topics you would like to learn about as part of the Ask the Experts, please let us know. Thank you so much, and have a safe trip home.